Because if you can't establish that value, then when you go to ask for investments in driving your applications, your inbound volume, I think for me, part of the definition is, you're really thinking about who is talking about your brand and how is that message getting out there in a really authentic way. Part of branding is communicating well with your candidates because you're a scale up or a startup, they don't know enough about your brand yet.
We are here with Anthony Azar, Director of Talent Acquisition at BenchSci. BenchSci is empowering scientists with the world's most advanced biomedical AI to bring about the more successful experiments. They have been recognized in Deloitte's Tech Fast 50 and ranked one of the best places to work in Canada. Anthony is the how can we do this better guy and an experienced talent acquisition professional. So I'm looking forward to sharing his perspective today. Anthony, thanks so much for being with us.
Hey, Lisa, thank you for having me.
Start by telling us more about BenchSci, your role, and the previous experiences that led you to the role.
Yeah, for sure. And you nailed it with a brief little bio there. But essentially, at BenchSci, what we're creating is an AI platform where we are training it to think like a scientist, with the intention to really reduce the time it takes to bring life-saving medication to the market. And so, at this moment, we have taken this AI, we have pushed a whole bunch of biomedical research data into it and connected it into the world's largest aggregation of preclinical drug development research. And so it's a really cool product now. We're building some more stuff as well, and lots of our clients are using it right now, which is really great. And they really love it because it's saving them a ton of time, which is awesome. And so some really good outcomes happening already on the platform, and more to come. But yeah, I joined BenchSci about 10 months ago. It's been a wild ride, as it normally is in scale up tech companies. And really just coming in to lead the entire talent acquisition function and to get us to a point where we can predictably hire a high number of folks in very senior technical roles, to really get that scale up engine going. And so there's been a lot of stuff, and we can talk more about that we've implemented and built and processes, and yeah, and so really happy with where we're at now, getting into the end of the year, and it's feeling nice as we are about to go on vacation that we've really started to nail it. So love that. Yeah, my background before BenchSci, I spent the last 7.5 years before this at another scale up called Traction on Demand that was in the Salesforce consulting space. Right before I joined BenchSci, Traction on Demand was actually acquired by Salesforce, so they got pulled into the mothership, so to speak. But Traction was another wild ride. I joined that company at about 130 people, grew the company to 1,500. We went from just a Canadian company to globally. We had offices in Canada, the U.S., India, Australia, New Zealand. So it was fun. Learned a ton there, and it was definitely a wild ride. Previous to that, more recruiting. I've done stints in agency, other kinds of technical. I grew up in retail long ago, leading large teams of very young people, which was for me also being a young person. It was a great training, lots of trials by fire, lots of learning about what is leadership. Am I good at it? Am I not? Thank you for all the training. This is helpful. So, yeah, that's me.
Well, I'd love to dive right into your experiences in employer branding. This is obviously a hot topic of conversation right now. And during your time working with Traction on Demand, you were pretty hands on in this process. So, talk to us about your experiences in employer branding and how you define and scale an employer brand approach globally.
Yeah, totally. And I had an opportunity to oversee this team in my last role, and also in my current one. And actually, right now, we've had a really interesting development where, in order to really take us to even the next level, we've hired a director of employer brand. And so he's taking over, which is amazing. He's coming from Google. And so I'm so excited to be partnering with him, such a smart dude. But yeah, there's a lot to do in this space, and it's really interesting because it's never done by just one person. It's really a partnership between talent acquisition, marketing, leaders in the organization. I think for me, part of the definition is, you're really thinking about who is talking about your brand and how is that message getting out there in a really authentic way. And I think that's really the crux of this, because you can have a couple of people in the organization that are, building content or doing these other things within employer brand, but the really key piece is that it can't just be them talking about it. They need to be an accelerator for everyone else within the organization. And so while um, if some companies are lucky enough to have employer branding people, they can build all of these things. It's really just about also enabling who else can share those narratives. And so I think when I've been most successful in this work before, I've had people that can, sit down with leaders or with people in talent acquisition to say, hey, here's some of the things that we can do, but what works for you? They could be writing some stories about some stuff that's going on in the organization, then working with others to share them. They can be enabling tools to help with that sharing. They can be, tracking what's going on some of the things within our world or on Glassdoor to make sure that we are understanding what's going on, responding to those reviews, and also bring the feedback to us so that we can really make sure that we're adjusting our process and actually feeding back into the organization some of those trends that are coming up that maybe we haven't heard in other places. And so it's important to do that enablement. And I think in both my last companies, we did that. And I've had executive teams that have been interested and excited to get on board with this, because nothing replaces the CEO or the C-suite saying something on LinkedIn, actually having a message out there where they are in their own voice or saying something. That's really where you're going to get the authentic messaging. Is, it's all well and good to have all this stuff, but unless you've got someone sitting down and like sharing with their network in a way that they expect to hear from them, that's when it really starts to hit. And my current CEO Laurent is wonderful at this. He's constantly pounding LinkedIn for us, which is great. And it actually takes very little from us to do that, because he is so passionate about what we're building at BenchSci, and not just the technology but also the culture. And so he's just always out there. And so it's really great. And then thinking to scale internationally with employer brand, there's always some things that work around the world, but I think as you move into new geographies, part of what local candidates are looking for is trying to understand, is this company actually operating here, or are they just operating in their home country? And I've seen that in the last two places that I worked, for sure, where we started to break into a new country, and in the beginning, candidates are a bit like tenuous and afraid. Like they want to know, like, am I going to be working with people here, or are you guys just a Canadian company trying to operate in this other place? And so it's really important to to show some stability and to show your mark, and to actually have local content that are targeted to those folks locally. And so, for BenchSci, our big international foray was into the UK. And so right now we're doing a lot of very specific UK work, whether it's, a LinkedIn life page where we actually have information about our team there and what they're doing and what their focus is. We're actually opening an office there. And so there's lots of that work going on as well. And then we've actually commissioned a really cool survey of the talent market in the UK to understand what's going on there, and also to show folks, we're interested in learning, and we're going to actually take all that information and reflect it back for everyone to see that. So I think that's a really cool thing. I also have an amazing recruiter in the UK, Sean Kennedy, and he is a branding superstar. He's just on it. And so that's another great thing to have, where you need to have somebody that can really fly the flag there. And sometimes it's someone like Sean who's really great on LinkedIn. But I also think it's important. You got to get out to the events. You got to start, I call it, flying the flag in different places to show that you're actually a real company. There are people around that work for this company. And then it just builds one step at a time. And I think with employer brand, it's not one of those things where you can do one thing and it's done. It's about regular attendance, regular posting, so that you can slowly build it, because the trust builds over time. It's not like a one-shot deal.
Now, I know you've been part of bringing some of the modernization of TA tools into your teams and bringing efficiencies throughout the process. So talk to us about, what are some of the process efficiencies that some TA teams, especially in the scale-up market, might be experiencing, and what are some quick fixes for those issues?
Yeah, I was thinking of a variety of things here. I think the first one is you got to find the talent. And I think when you're in a giant enterprise or a well-established organization, people just come to you. I think when you're going through the startup scale up, part of cracking the code is you have to get people actually interested in your brand. And so one part of it is that employer branding piece that we spoke about, but it's also just getting your jobs out in the right place, getting enough applications flowing in, getting enough sourcing happening. And so there's a variety of things that you can do. There's tons of tools out there that can drive your application flow, and I can talk about those. For me, the first part of that conversation, though, is really establishing the value to the business. Because if you can't establish that value, then when you go to ask for investments in driving your applications or your inbound volume, you are working with a budget of zero or a very small budget, and that's really not going to help you. There is some good organic stuff that you can do for free, but the reality is to have big turnaround, you need to actually put some money into it. And so establishing that value, and for me, it's about if the value of this role to the business is X, what happens if we don't fill it and we have to go to an agency? Not only is there going to be a time difference between when you wanted the talent to start and when they're actually going to start because the talent acquisition team can't fill it on time, but also if you end up having to use an agency, that's essentially like the most expensive way in order to fill a role. And so if you filled all of your roles through agency, that's a lot of money. And we essentially hire talent acquisition teams to reduce that cost. But it's not just the people in the seats, it's also the tools they need. So um, me personally, I really believe in LinkedIn. I do a lot of deep investment with them because I just see really great people coming from LinkedIn. And when I look at my hires on a whole, I get way more high quality applicants and way more hires out of the LinkedIn platform than I get out of anywhere else. They've not paid me to say this. I've just worked with them for a long time. There's a lot of other free tools out there where you might get a lot of interest, but I just find that the actual quality of the candidate is not as high. So that's like step one, get the flow going. I think the other piece is part of branding is communicating well with your candidates because you're a scale up or a startup, they don't know enough about your brand yet. Hopefully, you've got a great career website that actually starts to tell the story and the narrative of what you want to have going on. And I've been blessed to work in the last two organizations that are very mission driven. So how we talk about the brand is easy because we're trying to do some really cool stuff. But how you bake that into everything is important. Do you have a careers page? Do you have enough information on there? As you work with candidates and try to bring them through the process, how do you create the right education? Um, I don't know if templates have a bad name. I feel like they're underrated. Amazing. And it's about making good templates that one sound like a human actually wrote them and that you're trying to be warm and welcoming with a candidate and that you give some detail in it. Like you can link to really cool stuff on your website to make sure that they understand the organization. You can give them lots of hints. I believe in trying to create a ton of transparency in talent acquisition. Let's tell people what we're going to be asking them. Let's tell them what success looks like because we want them to do well. And the reality of interviews is that they're stressful and people often are bad at them, and that doesn't make them bad candidates. It just means it's a hard moment. So we're trying to bake all of that stuff within to the process so that if someone has gone to the website and they start moving through the process, by the time they get to the end, they should have a lot of information about what it's like to work in the organization so that they feel ready to make that decision. The last thing I think that's a challenge in scale up startup, and this is the thing we haven't cracked yet, but we're working on it, is the idea of talent planning. So once your talent acquisition team is actually able to deliver on your needs and move with a high velocity, that's a really magic point, and that's where we're at now. And now the barrier is now that we can move at the velocity that we need to, we also need the business to be able to decide on its needs in a timely manner. Because if we don't get them in time, then we still are not going to deliver on time. So that's the thing now, which is how many people, how fast, what levels, what geographies, how do we get ahead of that so that we can continue to move really quickly. And so there's a bunch of tools out there that we're exploring to try to do this a bit better. Lots of folks start doing it in G Sheets and Excel, which is kind of where we're at right now. The reality is you could do it a bunch of different ways. And the crux is really the timing. When do you start? When do you get your approvals? If you can get your timing down, then the exercise goes really well. And when you can't get the timing down, that's when it's tough. So,
Anthony, thank you so much for laying out that framework for us. Now, there's a heightened conversation in the past few years about making sure there's a good culture fit between companies and candidates. And I think this word can get kind of airy when we don't have tangible ways to measure what that actually means. So I'd love if you could dive into what are some of the tangible ways to determine and measure if someone is a good culture fit.
Yeah, and even the word culture fit has really been people are really upset about it because we don't want to talk about creating a monoculture, and I agree. And so, you know, we're really focused on trying to find some values alignment in all of our candidates to make sure that they join and that they're going to be successful. And for me, it's important because, you know, companies all run in different ways. I've worked in so many of them. They all feel different, and they're either working with their espoused values or with some values that maybe no one has really identified, but they actually exist in the company. And so for me, it's how do we actually, you know, get really clear on what the values of the organization are, both those ones that we communicate broadly and maybe those ones that are beneath the surface, that maybe are not talked about as much, and try to see, is there going to be some alignment. I don't think a person who works in an organization needs to have every value. I think they need to have a good chunk of them for sure, because I think you also want to add some different flavors of different humans. But if they don't share a good chunk of those values, like a majority of them, then I think they're going to find it really difficult to operate and to be very successful in the organization. And that's the thing that we talk about, because, you know, sometimes candidates hear this like, "Oh, you don't really match the values," like, and that's a no. And I think people can get really mad about this. And if I think if it's done in the right way, then the candidate should be happy that they're not going to work there, because it's probably not going to be great for them. They're going to hate it. And so that's like the piece of it. But how to measure it, I think, you know, like standard recruiting, I'm not going to say anything that's totally crazy here, but behavioral based interview questions based on the values that you want to be looking for. And a behavioral based interview question is a tell me a time question where you're trying to get someone to, you know, speak about how they reflected a value or some competency in the past. And so we typically lean into those pretty heavily. We're also trying to look for, you know, hints of these values coming out in other behavioral questions, where maybe we're asking for more of like a technical competency, but there's an opportunity to show that, you know, someone, you know, didn't have a technical competency and they talked about learning. Like, okay, does that show that their ability to advance is high? Like, one of our values is advancement. And so if someone who is really proactive in learning, like, to me, that's a hint that they're driving their own advancement, which means that they're aligned with one of our core values. And so I think there's a time for looking for those values in other interview questions, but I think it's also important to be really specific and direct about asking some questions around those specific values to make sure you give people an opportunity to really show whether or not they have those values.
Now, you guys are a remote first company based in Canada. So give us some insight into what you have found are some of the most difficult roles to fill or attract candidates toward, and what is your advice for companies struggling to fill in these areas?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. So, I mean, there's lots of hard jobs out there, mostly in engineering. You know, I think any job can be difficult depending on where you're at and the budgets that you're working with. If I tell you that we're having trouble hiring site reliability engineers, I think anybody who's in tech knows that that's a really difficult job. If you actually look at the, we just did a bit of an assessment on this one, and it's pretty wild actually for that one specific job. If you look on LinkedIn, there's actually like 100 and well, for every person within site reliability, there is more than that number of jobs in site reliability. So literally everybody who has this job could take a whole new job, and that there would still be there'd still be a whole bunch of roles that were not closed. And of course, anybody who loses some of those people are going to need it. So it's just like the market for this job is ridiculous. Apparently, nobody wants to do this job, which is I think it's actually really hard. So um, yeah, and I think with these tough roles, there's no one thing to do in order to fix it. Like, there's no holy grail where, oh, I can tell you sign up for this tool and everything's going to be great. You really need to make sure that your whole system is functioning so that you can fill these roles. And so, doing all the employer branding is a really good step. Making sure your jobs are out in the right places. You know, with the hard ones, you need to be on top of your sourcing too. And for us in engineering, I've really pivoted the team off of just using LinkedIn for outreaches, because what we're hearing from our engineers when we talk to them is that if they're not looking for a job, they just turn their notifications off from LinkedIn. So they're not even looking at emails. And so we've pivoted a lot of our direct outreach back into email, where at least we know it's getting into their inbox. Whether or not they reply is up to them. But if it's not even getting to their inbox, then of course our success rate is going to be even lower. And so we found that by pivoting back into email, it's certainly been helpful for our direct sourcing. Um, you know, the market is changing too, and so I think it's also it's a crappy time for some folks because there are layoffs that are happening in the market. But for folks at TA, that's always an opportunity. And I think it's an incredible story for us to be the folks to reach out directly to people who have been affected and impacted by layoffs, and to try to get them into a new role as quickly as possible so that, their life goes back to good, which is, working, being happy, all that kind of stuff. Um, the last thing I can say, especially in like startup scale up land, is you know, leaders like to have jobs where they just mash a whole bunch of things together into one role because then they can get everything in one person. But these purple unicorns are very difficult to find. So having those conversations up front, and looking at a job spec, and saying, hey, you've asked for all of this. The reality is that this is two people or three people because no one has all of this stuff, and trying to have those conversations early, I think, is really important. And so we're doing that. Often that's a partnership with other folks in HR, like a talent business partner kind of person. But sometimes in a smaller company, you don't have those people. So, talent acquisition folks sometimes need to have that. I think it's important to come prepared for it. Come prepared for those conversations with some information about what are the other jobs in the market look like. What are the typical duties of those roles? Can you show your leader that actually what you've asked for kind of sits in two different jobs, and why that might make it a bit more difficult? I think that's a really helpful thing to do, so that you're not just coming with your own perspective, but you're sort of bringing more information to help them make the decision. Um, sometimes you still need to have those unicorns, because in a scale up, you only have budget sometimes for one job for this team, and they just need that. And then the reality is just, you got to coach the leader on, well, if we are going to go find this unicorn, it's probably going to take a lot longer than we'd like. So, yeah.
Last question for you, Anthony. At Solvable, we're all about what drives purpose and satisfaction for people at work. So I would love to know what drives purpose and satisfaction for you at BenchSci.
Yeah, and I'm a big Brene Brown fan. I'll just put that out there now. She advocates for doing some values work, and that her vision on this is that you can really boil it down to two values, because sometimes people have like, here are my 5 or 10 core values. And so I did some of this work, and it was really interesting. The idea behind it is that you might have a bunch of values, but there's probably two that are underpinning everything, that really, you might have other ones, but these are the core ones, and then everything else is sort of like another level up. And so I did some of that work, and it was difficult, but it was really eye-opening as well, because I started to see, oh yeah, there's this yin and yang in my life, and there are these two values. And so one is growth and one is community, and they're not the same, and they kind of, growth often overtakes community, which is the one that's tough, especially being in like high growth tech. I get a lot of satisfaction for being in a place, seeing my team making the hires, us growing, delivering on new processes, all of these things. That tickles my fancy a lot. So, but then when I start to feel stressed, I realize that I'm doing too much of that, and that I haven't done enough of the community stuff. And so that's the other thing that I need to like take a step back. And community is different in a remote first company, and that's like the thing that I'm still trying to unpack. We're doing a lot of things in this area to try to make sure that people have the right connection points. And a lot of where I think we're leaning to is, we can do remote connections, and we've got Donut in Slack where we can, meet with random people, which is great. It helps you start to break down some of the walls. And there's lots of groups that we have, and working on ERGs. Like, there's a whole bunch of great stuff from a community perspective. But I think for me, nothing replaces actually seeing some folks. And so we're really encouraging all of our teams to at least once a year get together and have some time where it's not just about work, but it is around building your personal connections with other humans. How can you share something with them so that you walk away and you feel closer, and that you've built trust with them? And so just had an amazing opportunity to go to Montreal and meet with our whole people leadership team, and we did a bunch of really cool stuff. Just a lot of sharing, to be honest, so that you can trust the humans that are around you. And so that was really great for me, really filled my cup. And I think BenchSci recognizes that. And so I love that piece, because it's just important. You got to know the people you're working with. You got to trust them. You got to like them. And I have a really great team that I'm working with, which is really nice. So, and I mean, the team that reports to me is also wonderful as well. And we're planning another session with them in the new year, which I'm excited about.
Anthony, thank you so much for being on with us today. And thank you all for listening to Architects of Contemporary Hiring.